Mick Jagger is 83 years old today. He is still on stage. He is still running, literally running, from one end of a stadium stage to the other, in front of 60,000 people, at an age when most men are grateful to walk to the end of their street without losing their breath. 63 years after he started, he is still doing the thing he was built to do. This is the story of every reason he had to stop and why he never did. Dartford, Kent, 1961. A railway platform. Two teenagers who had known each other as small children but had not spoken in years recognized each other on the morning train. One of them, Mick Jagger, 18 years old, a student at the London School of Economics, was carrying a stack of imported American blues records under his arm. Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Howlin' Wolf. The other, Keith Richards, 17, an art school dropout, saw the records and said something. They started talking. They did not stop. Within a year, they had a band. Within 2 years, they had a manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, a 19-year-old publicist who looked at the Beatles and decided the world needed the opposite. He told Mick and Keith to write their own songs. They had never tried. Their first original single, Tell Me, was tentative, thin, a sketch. Their second was Not. By 1965, Satisfaction was the biggest rock and roll song on earth. Mick Jagger was 22 years old. He had a voice that sounded like a blues singer from the Mississippi Delta, had been raised in suburban Kent. He had a body that moved as if every joint had been loosened by a mechanic. He had a face that the camera could not look away from, not because it was handsome, but because it was alive. That was 1965, 61 years ago. Most bands from 1965 lasted 5 years. The Rolling Stones are still here. The question is not how they survived. The question is how many times they should have ended and didn't. The first reason to stop came in July 1969. Brian Jones, the man who had founded the Rolling Stones, who had named them, who had booked their first gig, who had been the band's original leader, was found dead in the swimming pool of his home in Sussex. He was 27 years old. He had been fired from his own band 1 month earlier. Brian Jones had created the Rolling Stones. He had heard a Muddy Waters record in 1961 and decided that a white English blues band was the only thing worth doing with his life. He had recruited Mick and Keith. He had given the band its name from a Muddy Waters song. And then, over the course of 5 years, Mick and Keith had become the center of the band, and Brian had drifted to the edges, and the edges had become drugs and paranoia and isolation. And on July 3rd, 1969, he was gone. 2 days later, 2 days after their founder died, the Rolling Stones played a free concert in Hyde Park in front of 250,000 people. Mick Jagger stood on stage in a white tunic and read a passage from Shelley's Adonais as a tribute to Brian. Then the band played. The first song was I'm Yours and I'm Hers. They played for 2 hours. Some people called it tasteless. Others called it the only possible response, that the best way to honor a musician is to play. Mick did not explain his decision publicly. He simply showed up, stood on the stage where his dead friend should have been standing, and did the work. That was the first time Mick Jagger had every reason to stop. He was 26 years old. The man who had started the whole thing was dead. The band could have ended right there and nobody would have blamed them. What do you do when the person who built the house dies in the swimming pool? 5 months after Brian's death, the Rolling Stones played Altamont, December 6, 1969, a free concert at the Altamont Speedway in Northern California, intended to be the West Coast's answer to Woodstock. 300,000 people. The Hells Angels had been hired as security in exchange for $500 worth of beer. It was a decision that nobody involved would ever be able to explain afterwards. During the Stones' set, a young man named Meredith Hunter was stabbed to death by a Hell's Angel in front of the stage. He was 18 years old. The killing was captured on film by the Maysles brothers, who were making a documentary about the tour. The footage is still one of the most disturbing things ever recorded at a rock concert. Altamont ended the 1960s. That is the accepted reading. That if Woodstock was the dream, Altamont was the morning after. The counterculture died in a dirt field in California with a teenager's blood on the ground, and the Rolling Stones still playing because nobody had told them to stop. Mick Jagger watched the documentary footage later. He saw himself on stage, 26 years old, trying to calm a crowd that could not be calmed, asking people to cool out while violence was happening 30 feet from the microphone. He did not speak about Altamont publicly for years. That was the second reason to stop. A man had died at their concert. The decade had ended with their name attached to the worst night in rock history. Any other band would have retreated. The Stones released Sticky Fingers 5 months later. It went to #1 in both countries. The 1970s belonged to the Stones. Sticky Fingers in 1971. Exile on Main Street in 1972, recorded in a rented villa in the south of France because Keith Richards was a tax exile from England. The whole band living in the basement, playing through the night, the album coming together in a haze of heat and noise and genius. It is now considered one of the greatest rock albums ever made. At the time, some critics called it sloppy. By the mid-70s, Mick Jagger was the most famous rock star on earth. He was dating Bianca. He was at Studio 54. He was on the cover of everything. The Stones were selling out stadiums before stadium tours were even a standard industry format. They were, by any measure, the biggest band in the world. And then punk happened. 1976, 1977, the Sex Pistols, the Clash. A generation of younger musicians who looked at Mick Jagger and his silk scarves and his Nicaraguan mansion and his jet-set lifestyle and said, "This is everything wrong with rock and roll." Johnny Rotten wore an "I Hate Pink Floyd" t-shirt, but the contempt extended to every band from the 60s that was still collecting stadium money in the 70s. The Rolling Stones were the biggest target. That was the third reason to stop. The culture had turned against them. The music press, which had built them up in 1965, was now writing them off as dinosaurs. A new generation was saying loudly that the Stones were irrelevant. Mick Jagger's response was "Some Girls," released in 1978. It was lean, fast, and mean, the closest the Stones had come to a punk record. "Miss You" had a disco bass line. "Shattered" was New York street noise turned into a song. The album sold 6 million copies. The dinosaur had learned to run faster than the thing trying to kill it. The fourth reason to stop was Keith Richards. By the mid-1980s, Mick and Keith were barely speaking. Mick had released a solo album, She's the Boss, in 1985, and Keith had taken it as a betrayal. Keith said publicly that Mick had stabbed him in the back. Mick said Keith was living in the past. They gave interviews attacking each other. They did not speak for nearly 3 years. This was not a creative disagreement. This was two men who had written songs together since they were teenagers. Satisfaction, Sympathy for the Devil, Wild Horses, Gimme Shelter, looking at each other across a room and seeing a stranger. The Glimmer Twins, the songwriting partnership that had defined rock and roll for 2 decades, had fractured. Every music journalist in the world wrote the obituary. The Rolling Stones were finished. Mick was going pop. Keith was going solo. The greatest rock and roll band in history was over, killed not by drugs or death or cultural irrelevance, but by the 2 men who ran it being unable to sit in the same room. In 1989, they reconciled. Nobody knows exactly what was said. Keith later described it as a phone call. Mick later described it as just getting on with it. The Steel Wheels Tour launched that year. 60 cities, $300 million in ticket sales. The largest rock tour in history at that time. They had survived the death of their founder. They had survived Altamont. They had survived punk. And now they had survived each other. How many lives does a band get? The fifth reason to stop was Mick Jagger's own body. In 2019, at the age of 75, Mick underwent heart valve replacement surgery. The tour was postponed. For the first time in 60 years, Mick Jagger was forced to sit still. He was back on stage within 3 months. Witnesses at the first post-surgery concert said he moved exactly the way he had moved at 25. The same rooster strut, the same arm-swinging sprint from one end of the stage to the other, the same loose-hipped swagger that had defined rock performance since 1965. 75 years old, 3 months after heart surgery, running. And then, in August 2021, Charlie Watts died, the drummer, the quiet one. The man who had sat behind the kit for 58 years, who had never once been in a tabloid scandal, who dressed in Savile Row suits and collected Arabian horses, and loved jazz more than rock and roll, but played rock and roll anyway because the band needed him. Charlie was the heartbeat, and the heartbeat stopped. That was the sixth reason, the one that should have ended everything. The Stones without Charlie Watts was unthinkable, like a body without a pulse. Keith cried publicly for the first time anyone could remember. Mick posted a photograph of Charlie smiling on a drum stool and wrote nothing underneath it. The Stones hired Steve Jordan to play drums. They went back on tour. Mick Jagger stood on a stage without Charlie Watts for the first time since 1963 and sang Satisfaction and Sympathy for the Devil and Gimme Shelter and every song Charlie had ever held together with that quiet, precise, jazz-inflected snare. He did it because the work was not finished. The work is never finished. Mick Jagger is 83 years old today. He has outlived Brian Jones by 57 years. He has outlived the 60s, the 70s, punk, new wave, grunge, Britpop, and the entire digital revolution. He has survived the death of his founder, the worst night in rock history, the contempt of an entire generation, a 3-year war with his closest collaborator, heart surgery, and the loss of the man who kept the beat for 58 years. He is still on stage. He is still running. He is still doing the thing he was built to do at an age when the thing itself should be impossible. The voice is older. The body is leaner. The face has earned every line. But the work continues, and the work is the only thing that ever mattered. Most bands from 1965 lasted 5 years. The Rolling Stones are still here, not because they were lucky, not because they were careful, because the man at the front refused every single time to let the last reason be the last reason. Happy 83rd, Mick, from all of us who kept coming back. Subscribe. We do this every day.